Hi. In this lecture, we will look at a concise discussion of relevant issues regarding school funding and finance. Our discussions will center around the legislature's power to levy taxes, to levy revenue projections, and of course, the legal challenges involving funds for public schools. The landmark Rodriguez case had a profound impact on the system of finance across the country. And it addressed public school finance in the context of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and issued a ruling that had a significant impact on systems of finance everywhere in the country, including Kentucky. Since there is ongoing litigation regarding systems of finance in virtually every state in the union except Hawaii, it's really important that we spend some time in this section looking at the specific case in Kentucky, and that's the Rose v. Council for Better Education. So let's talk, starting off with taxation for public schools. The state has inherent power to levy taxes on citizens to support public education. While the U.S. Constitution imposes no legal obligation on the federal government to operate this system, the right to operate public schools is reserved to the state by virtue of the 10th Amendment, the Reserve Clause in the Constitution. State legislatures are generally authorized to provide for public system of education. They may also levy taxes and develop a systematic method for distributing those funds. School districts are agents of the state, but do not possess broad powers to levy taxes, and they're subject only to the powers delegated to them by the state legislature. Tax rates are generally based on estimated revenue needed to meet financial obligations of a school district. Estimated revenue projections should be realistic, made in good faith, and based on accurate data. School districts may not use taxing authority with the express purpose of creating surpluses, and this is one of the controversies regarding fund balances. These actions would constitute a breach of good faith. Some states have elected to create a state-required property tax system which calls all revenues raised through state taxes to be allocated to support education. And so the tax rate describes the burden ratio or percentage in which a person is taxed. The average tax rate is defined by the ratio of the amount of taxes paid to the tax base. The tax rate is determined by the amount of tax levied from all or part of a district. In many cases, it's based on the assessed property value, which is what determines those tax ratios. And of course, these tax rates vary among communities and states. And so in looking at the challenge for tax rates, this case, the Edgewood Independent School versus Kirby, is a Texas case where they faced a decision or a series of legal challenges that regarded the funding inequities involving Mexican-American students who were products of poor communities. The plaintiffs alleged that the state's method of funding public schools minimally violated four principles of the state constitution, which obliged the state legislature to provide an efficient and free public school system. They argued further that the current funding system violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, as well as the state constitution. In the lower court decision, it was held that the state system of funding was unconstitutional, but later reversed by the State Court of Appeals. However, the Texas Supreme Court unanimously confirmed the lower court's ruling and ordered the legislature to develop an equitable system of financing schools within a year. The legislature passed legislation to increase funding by $500 million. However, the plaintiffs argued that the basic structure of system finance had not changed. This Texas decision is a very similar decision to what we'll see happen in Kentucky with the Rose v. Council decision. So there are also a series of legal challenges to school funding that we have to address. School finance programs are often challenged in both federal and state constitutions. Most challenges have focused on issues regarding equity of these finance programs with respect to the tax burdens. Other challenges involve assertions that parents and their children are denied the benefits of equal education opportunity based on disparate tax revenue and the distribution of revenue among districts within the state. Really rich districts and rich property areas like Lexington, for example, have a much higher revenue opportunity compared to poorer areas like those in the East or some of the urban parts of the state. Most challenges involving school funding center around these alleged equal protection violations regarding the 14th Amendment, as well as equal protection provisions found in state constitutions. Most of the litigation really have been addressed at the state level with state courts, since education is a state function. There are two cases that I think are worth noting that tried these cases on the national level, and it set a very significant precedent. Serrano v. Priest is the first of those, and this case represented this early challenge to the disparities in funding based on the equal protection violations in the 14th Amendment. It's a California case, and their Supreme Court established the view that education was a constitutionally protected fundamental interest, and wealth was a suspect classification. Where a fundamental interest or suspect classification is involved, the court held that the state must demonstrate that it has a compelling interest that justifies the law, and the distinctions drawn by law are necessary to further its purpose. This somewhat confusing position by the court basically placed the burden of proof on the state to justify the fairness of its funding program. But the decision reached by the state Supreme Court in Serrano established a standard to determine whether or not a school finance plan was constitutional, and a lot of subsequent decisions, including the Rose case, came based on that original precedent. The court established this idea of fiscal neutrality. Fiscal neutrality basically means that students have the right to the same level of education regardless of their fiscal support and regardless of the wealth that they have in their own person and the district that they reside in. And so based on the court's ruling, a child's education is not based on that wealth or the wealth of the school district. So the Serrano case established the view that the state had responsibility for financing education, and of course that this fiscal neutrality would be significant. The San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez is another very significant and arguably one of the most important landmark cases in the history of education law. Legal challenges that were pursued in this case, both at the state and federal level, challenge funding programs throughout the country. So it is one case, but like Brown v. Board, there are a whole bunch of other cases wrapped up in this one. And of course, it used the fiscal neutrality standard embraced in Serrano to address the disparity in wealth among school districts. The argument is that wealthy districts have advantages that those that are not wealthy need to have rectified. This case in Texas reached the U.S. Supreme Court, and it was a split 5-4 decision. The Supreme Court reversed the lower court ruling that the Texas finance system was unconstitutional. The court did note the discrepancies created by the funding system, where there were great disparities based on the ad valorem or property taxes from one district to another. But even though they admitted that there were discrepancies and disparities, regardless of that, in spite of that, the court concluded that the Texas funding system did not work to the disadvantage of any class or group. Mostly they argued that poor citizens throughout the system were not disadvantaged as a class. The Texas funding system did not interfere with the right to an education. While undeniably of high importance, education, this is key, was not recognized by the court as being among the rights granted by the U.S. Constitution. The court held for the state of Texas in concluding that the system of funding was not unconstitutional, mostly because it wasn't their place to, and it wasn't constitutionally a provision that was protected. And so the Rodriguez ruling essentially removed future finance cases from reaching the highest court in the land. The U.S. Supreme Court's decision effectively placed legal challenges regarding all school funding programs in the state courts, since education is a function of states. The compelling aspect of this decision was that the Texas case did not interfere with a fundamental right, since education, while undeniably important, is not recognized by the High Court as among those guaranteed by the Constitution. The school funding program, according to the Supreme Court, bore a rational relationship to a legitimate state purpose, which is that of education. So the post-Rodriguez case is following this landmark ruling. The strategy that began to be used by plaintiffs who challenged funding programs shifted from the constitutionality of the funding schemes to the issues of educational quality and adequacy, which affected educational outcomes for the poor. There was a California case, of course, that was part of that, the Williams case, that basically focused its emphasis on the horrible conditions and the equity and the adequacy. But again, other cases that followed using adequacy and quality, as well as a lack of necessary resources to support quality education for children. You saw these cases springing up all around: New Jersey, New York, Kansas, Illinois. The court basically ruled against plaintiffs in advancing views that issues related to quality are the sole responsibility of the school district that must be answered by the legislature. The court tended to struggle to some degree with the issue of educational quality, and the idea that you can't render a judicial decision based on educational quality. And so there's so many variables that affect student achievement that some courts believe they are really in the domain of educators, school districts, professionals, and legislators rather than the courts. Added to the court's dilemma are the whole cost factor in providing adequate educational services to students. And it's apparent that the funding distribution programs really are the center of the debate here among parents, citizens, school officials. Since there's no universally accepted quality education model that has distributive application throughout the country, the debate is likely to continue. So the equity and adequacy funding of public schools is really where we find ourselves at the present. And of course, the Rose decision in 1989, 1990 that led to the Kentucky Education Reform Act really squarely became one of the models in this world. Equity typically denotes per pupil expenditures that are distributed equally throughout the district. Equity is really difficult to achieve when school funding is based on property tax, and you have that's one of the primary sources of funding in most states, and you have very rich and very poor property levels that often are segregated in many communities. Great disparities that existed among communities within states based on that assessed valuation of property led to consistent problems here. Consequently, in wealthy communities, more funds are generated to support schools than less wealthy districts. And so states attempted to achieve levels of parity by developing funding formulas that feature state aid minus local effort, which results in poor districts receiving more state funding and wealthy districts receiving less state funding. And that's something that, of course, that's a theme in the finance course. Even so, disparities exist because local districts who are able to do so may tax themselves to generate desired funds to support school facilities and other elements of their program. So the situation results in a whole lot of legal challenges. And of course, the Rose decision that we will discuss in detail is one of those decisions that essentially ruled the entire funding model and system of schools, common schools in Kentucky, unconstitutional. And that led the legislature to pass an aggressive reform program that included funding formulas that dealt with some of those disparities, but also completely rethinking the approach to public education in the common schools in Kentucky. And of course, the Rose decision is very much alive and well. All the challenges that really effectively are looking at tax credits, vouchers, even charter schools, many of which are going back to some of the statements of the Rose v. Council decision, and those we will discuss in some detail.